Cat 8, the Sorcerer, the Burglar.
The sorcerer will follow a blinkered path. He knows nothing of the destination. He knows nothing of that which put down the path. He stumbles on. The puppet master in his tower awaits his puppet.
The afternoon passed quicker than normal for Tallow. He kept the thrill of his recent find hidden from the other apprentices and Master Belatro by wearing his familiar dour-faced expression. At some point in mid-morning, whilst the master was waffling about fire blades and ice walls, his roving eye caught the glint of silver amongst the chalk stubs underfoot, and in a poor display of subterfuge, he dropped his chalk, then bent down to retrieve it. His missing key. Tallow stifled a grin behind his hand. Come late afternoon, the master looked to the window. The lesson ended, and, for the first time, Tallow was thankful for the daily charade of having to detach himself from his thigh-gripping desk. For today, like every day, Tallow was the last to leave the classroom. The apprentices had left, no doubt running and prancing, skipping and dancing, back to their homes. Tallow glanced out of the window. As he hoped, the master was outside, downstairs, bumbling, waffling, and gesturing flamboyantly to the confectioner who worked and lived opposite. Tallow noticed that this exchange of
"Business good today? How's the wife?"
and
"Strange weather for the time of year,"
was a daily ritual that both men actually seemed to enjoy. They weren't too dissimilar in appearance. Both were squat and well-whiskered, whereas the master wore a weathered purple robe. The confectioner's garb of choice was a white apron, splattered with flour, sugar, and fruit pips. Quickly and quietly, Tallow trotted down the stairwell and positioned himself by the shop counter. Although nothing was truly bought or sold here, this ground level of the tower had always simply been known as the shop counter. Standing roughly midway between the exit and the sole window that looked into the ground floor of the tower, he reached tentatively into one of his many robe pockets and pulled out a parcel wrapped in one of his thicker handkerchiefs. He crouched down. As the exchange of trivialities continued between the master and the confectioner, he quickly unwrapped the parcel and placed the contents, a single shard of mirror, on the floor against the base of the counter. Ensuring he remained hidden from view, he shuffled to the window, turned, and examined the reflection from the shard. Happy with his work, he grinned and thought that if he was any sharper, he'd cut himself. Master Belatro was still stood outside the doorway as Tallow ducked his head and left, nodding briefly to the master. The master threw a quick smile back. At least Tallow assumed it was a smile, difficult as it was to tell, with the master's whiskers seeming to choke his lower face and upper chest, very much like the ivy that choked the base of the tower. Once out of eyesight, Tallow half skipped, half walked, back to his lodgings. For close to a year now, Tallow had rented a lower floor flat in a pleasant area of the city. It was close enough to the hill that housed the clock to be spared any serious crime and grime, yet far away enough from it to be spared the scrum of rickshaws, tourists, and novelty shops selling overpriced tat. In all, Tallow liked where he lived. Tallow's landlady, Phasma Frous, lived on the floor above, and ran a business performing seances for elderly and very gullible ladies. She and Tallow exchanged few words, as their paths rarely crossed. This suited Tallow well, for he struggled to be polite in her company. She had a face like an old prune, a voice as dry as sandpaper, and a ridiculous lisp. He noted that she had an obsession with wearing white dresses that looked more like funeral shrouds, and was always seen sporting one of her multicoloured wigs, each the height of a small child. She amused and worried Tallow in equal measure. Almost every night he weathered the strange noises that filtered down from his ceiling. There were bumps, scrapings mostly, but on occasion he couldn't help but smirk when he heard the bleat of an old deer exclaim,
"My Ernest is here!"
or
Stanley, is that you?"
he knew that she tied very fine threads to her toes, threads that were attached to the curtains, a chandelier, a candelabra, anything in fact that would make a scene if, with a jerk of a foot, there would be a swish of something or a toppling of something else. He also noted that every one of her clients had the eyesight of a myopic mole wearing a blindfold. One evening, when their thumps, bumps, scrapes, and peaks had come to an end, Tallow sat in his favourite and only chair, brooding over how he might get past the enchanted steel door guarding the tower's top floor. He pondered various ideas. He had whittled down a dozen or so potential strategies to just 3. He pondered more until the hour hand on his clock had progressed about a quarter of a full turn, and then he came to a decision. He donned a plain brown tunic, a tatty black overcoat, and headed back to the academy. He grabbed a shuttered lantern as he left. He quickly reached Cheese Street, a street famous for housing the Academy of Sorcery and for never ever having a cheese shop. He kept close to the side of each street and alley, hugging the buildings to his left. Even at such a late hour, he didn't want to encounter anyone who might be roaming about. Avoiding loose cobbles, anything crackly underfoot, and the puddles forming from the fine rain that was falling, he crept up to the tower. From Bellatro's living quarters on the 2nd floor, a thin sheet of light shone out from his arrow-slit window onto the street. Tallow waited until he heard the sound of Bellatro's voice chatting to his collection of stuffed birds. This was a regular occurrence. Tallow shook his head. Tallow shuffled to the ground floor window. He knelt down and peered inside. There was just enough light from the street lamps for him to be able to see the outline of the shard of mirror he had laid so carefully earlier. He looked up and down the street. There was no one there. He opened a single shutter on his lantern and propped it on his knee. He then positioned the lantern so it focused a narrow beam through the window and directly onto the piece of mirror within the tower. He grinned, baring teeth as long and as white as piano keys, and removed a pink pebble from his pocket. Unknown to Tallow, something tucked between the roof's lip and the guttering of the confectioner's opposite was watching him. Something no bigger than a cat, and distinctly leathery. With the pebble in his palm, he closed his eyes and concentrated. His will began to grow. It started as a small flame in his mind, swelling to eventually fill his whole. A muscle in his face started to twitch. This basic spell required just the use of one of the 5 aspects of transfiguration. Tallow brought forth the visualization of this aspect, momentum, to the fore of his imagination. Now, in his mind's eye, he saw 3 overlapping ovals around a circular core. This was the pattern the master had taught and ingrained into his mind. Tallow had added his own embellishments, as only he would. He had put a small ball on each of the ovals, red ones. These balls gave the impression that they were whizzing around and following the lines of the ovals. It worked for Tallow. The mental processes that hid behind the visualization started to channel, mould, and direct his will. He clenched the pink pebble, a rhodochrosite, tightly. He exhaled and looked into the window at the shard's reflection of the door's lock within. The pebble became warm in his hand, and the bar locking the door slid up, leaving the tower unlocked. Tallow pocketed the pebble, picked up the lantern from his knee, eased open the door, and moved into the tower as quickly and quietly as he could. He was in, he thought. Bolting the door behind him, he closed the open shutter of the lantern and stood for a moment in the near darkness, waiting for his eyes to adjust. The muffled one-way conversation between Bellatro and his stuffed feathered friends continued unabated from the floor above. Tallow shivered slightly, more so from the thrill of the mission than the cold. He made his way across the floor to the base of the stairwell and started to climb the winding steps, 3 at a time, but as quietly as he could. He reached the steel door on the 2nd floor seconds later. There he stood for a moment, nibbling his lower lip.
Chapter 9. The Door.
Stood before the door, the enchanted door that kept those out of the tower's top story, the almost childish tales of Lucy Prinder, Tommy Trout, and moribund Caltrop felt less like fantasy and now more like fiction to Tallow. Which death would he suffer, if any? What would hurt most? Immolation, organ origami, or popping eyeballs? And now stood before this door, Tallow could recall other unfortunates the master had told and retold. There was that burglar chappie, very determined, went by the name of Ulf the Lout. He had, according to the master, tried to prise the door open with a jemmy. Tallow recalled the master's rhyme.
Heed the tale of Ulf the Lout, a burglar for his life throughout. The door resisted, but he persisted, and he was drawn half in, half out.
Master Bellatrix always chuckled at this point with his play on words. The master further added to this truth by telling his gullible flock, -1, that for many weeks after, every time he opened the door, so Ulf would be pulled apart, only to be magically made whole once the door was shut, and his shouts and screams and gurgles would cause the nesting ravens to flap and add their own noise.
It was fortunate,
so the master had said,
that the squawks of the ravens masked the screams of the burglar,
foolish enough to be where he was not.
intended.
Tallow hummed, and now the apprentice sorcerer recalled the tale of Hermione blowing. How did the master riddle her death? Tallow tapped his teeth with a long finger. Ah, yes.
Heed the tale of Hermione blowing.
Before the door, and most unknowing, she knocked just twice, and in a thrice her skin fell away, her guts all showing.
And without a skin, so the master continued,
she was like a pie without pastry. Everything just kind of fell out and collapsed in a heap.
Even Tallow grimaced at the imagery. There are others who suffered a similar fate, others who the master would gleefully recall with a tune in his tone and a clap to every syllable. What would Tallow's rhyme be?
Heed the tale of Archibald Widdershins, trespass where he knew he shouldn't have been.
And here he stands, head in hands, waiting to be fried, solidified, or turned to tin.
No, that's way too tame for the master. He'd want something more graphic, more harrowing.
Here stands Tallow before the door, wondering which fate was in store.
Would death be quick? Would he hear a whoosh and a click? Or would he end up as a shower of gore?
And then his fate would be forever remembered and retold in the master's foolish words. Or Tallow's mind was picking up speed now.
Archibald Widdershins, a sorcerer most glum, would soon find he'd come undone. The door just loomed. The intruder was doomed, as he promptly disappeared up his own.
Stop!
Stop indeed, thought Tallow. A good call. Damn silly rhymes. He was never any good at making them up. Need to focus on the problem, not add to it. Stop indeed. Tallow was thankful for the voice of reason inside his head, and that voice, the voice that said stop, had a good bit of authority about it. Sounded like a good bit of echo, too. How strange. and it was gravelly.
Look around.
There was that voice again, his voice of reason. Tallow smiled and looked around, eager to uncover the secret of the door. The door was covered in spirals and runes. He couldn't read any of them. The walls were just walls, stony and bare. The steps beneath his feet were just steps, stony and bare and chalky. The master had left chalky footprints of his passing. Tallow turned his head and looked closer at the step directly below his feet. On one side was a chalky mark at the base of the wall, as if the master had nudged this area with his toe. Tallow nudged the exact spot with his own toe. There was a click. Something gave, and then the door started to slide open. Tallow grinned, exposing teeth too large for a mouth too small. On a remote cliff, in a dilapidated lighthouse, in a room strewn with debris, dank with mould, and littered with small bones, perched a rat. It knew not why it was there, nor had any recollection of how it came to be there. It moved strangely, like a puppet under the control of a clumsy puppeteer. It teetered towards a table, and on this table was a large open jar. In this jar was a dark yellow-brown liquid through which the vague outline of something malformed could be seen. The rat leapt atop the table, skidded a few inches, and resumed its mechanical walk towards the jar. Once at the base of the jar, the rat leapt up once more, landing perfectly balanced on the rim. For a split second the rat tottered. The trance was broken, and it looked about, nose twitching, but then a hand, smaller than a child's, reached up from the liquid and grasped the rat by its tail. The rat shrieked in alarm. Its claw was scratching and scraping against the glass sides before it was pulled under the surface. The thing in the jar jolted once, twice, and then was still. The surrounding liquid clouded with red.